All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is once again the great Dr. James McGrath. Dr. McGrath is the Clarence L. Goodwin Chair in New Testament Language and Literature at Butler University and the author of several incredible books, including the brand new Beyond Deconstruction, Building a More Expansive Faith, out now on Eerdmans, where he discusses the process of deconstruction, changing one's mind about issues of faith and how to rebuild. We'll be discussing this book on the show today. Dr. McGrath, welcome back to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thank you so much. Please call me James. I've been on here enough times that we should be on a first name basis.
Well, perfect, James. Yeah, I appreciate that. I have gotten some new listeners, and I think you were just on maybe like 2 or 3 months ago, so it hasn't been that long since I had you on the show. But just tell us a little bit about your background before we get into the conversation today.
Yeah, and the truth is that my background is directly connected to the book, although not in the way that has been true of other books of mine, right? So other books that I've written have been the products of my research, right? One of the things that academics do for a living. And my main field is New Testament, early Christianity, and so I've written mostly about that. Have also done work on the intersection of religion and science fiction, and so have published on that. But they're things that I find interesting, and they connect with sort of my own faith tradition and religious identity and life and things like that. So, but this book is a much more personal one, and it really is about sort of the journey and the experience of being a person who's motivated by their faith to go to Bible college and then pursue academic study of the Bible with a view to teaching, and possibly doing sort of mission work and things like that. And what often happens is you're motivated by a faith that has tells you some things about the Bible, about what it is, what you should expect from it, how it should behave, as it were. And then you study this collection of texts, and the texts themselves throw you curveballs and basically upset some of the things you've been told about the Bible, right? And that can be extremely disconcerting. And so the way the book connects with what a lot of people have been going through in recent years, with the free flow of information, greater availability, and more convenient access to the fruits of academic study of the Bible, there are places online where people are sharing things, are sharing summaries of things, or more people are reading scholarship or listening to podcasts with academic scholars in ways that was not true before, right? And so I think to a greater extent, more people are encountering the fruits of academic study, and as a result, not just of that, but certainly that's one of the factors. There are people who are discovering, as a result of this academic research that we publish, that things that they've been told about the Bible, it's at the very least not that simple, right? And there's the complexity to it, and there are other aspects to it, or these texts, not just in terms of possibilities of contradictions or things like that, but the text might not mean as clearly the things that you've been told they mean, and so directly support your beliefs in that way. And so people are wrestling with that, and some lose their faith as a result. Some stop going to church and still consider themselves Christians, but are not really sure and are sort of wandering. And since I've come through the process of rethinking a lot of things as a result of my studies and come out the other end as someone who's a Christian, but with beliefs that are different in a lot of ways than they were when I started this process, it seemed almost necessary, at the very least appropriate, but maybe even that I had an obligation to share just what that journey was like, as sort of a guide to others who might be going along not exactly the same path, but something similar. And so in a sense, this is a book that sort of unveils and sort of reveals and tells the story of my background and my journey in a way that something I've written about John the Baptist does not as directly, right? It's in there, in a sense. Anytime somebody writes something, our background is reflected in there. But this one is much more personal, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I want to, before we even get into the details of the book, I want to talk about the term deconstruction itself, because it's a word that I feel like people have been using for a little over a decade now. Maybe it goes back further than that. But I was not on social media until I started this podcast in 2022, and I kind of had a familiarity with deconstruction, kind of like what it meant. I did not realize how politicized that term had become and how angry people were either for deconstruction or against deconstruction. And I've been thinking over the last couple of years as I've just reflected on this that we need to have more of a calm conversation about it and be able to analyze it in a more sober manner. So, what, like in your from your perspective, what is deconstruction? How would you define it?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. And to start with, there's a prehistory of this term that goes back multiple decades. Uh, an approach to literature that was labeled deconstruction, right, was pioneered by this sort of philosopher and expert in literature named Jacques Derrida, and used the term to refer to essentially reading against the grain of a text, like noticing the other possibilities for interpretation that are there. And that's not what most people talking about today are talking about. There is a sense in which there's at least some continuity. I mean, the first instinct of academics is when a term gets used in a non-technical way and starts to become popular, is to say like, no, that's not what it means. Language, we can't control it in that way, and it's come to mean this thing. But there's a sense in which even the process of discovering that there are other ways of reading biblical texts than maybe the one way that you've been told is the right way to understand it. There are details in the text that might push back against your interpretation. That very much is in keeping with sort of what Derrida was focusing on in literature and the philosophy that emerged out of that. But what the contemporary use of the term is focused on is a wide variety of types of experience that all fall under the umbrella of rethinking one's faith and critically examining one's faith. And there's been hostility towards the term from certain conservatives who view the process as essentially destructive, and it can be, right? If you've got a sort of a narrow set of beliefs that you've not examined closely, examining them, and that's anywhere on the sort of the political, the religious spectrum, any type of religion, that's not something that's only in one sort of one camp or one category. But if you have been steeped in that kind of unquestioning allegiance to a perspective, then closely examining it can be destructive of that in the form in which you knew it. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is that oftentimes people experience, if the Bible has been sort of foundational, and whether it should have been or not is another question, but if the Bible has been foundational, it's been central to their faith, their sense of how they know anything at all about God and things like that, then if the Bible becomes something that you're less certain about, then everything related to your faith becomes something that you're less certain about. And if having the sense of certainty, the illusion of certainty is what faith is all about in certain conservative contexts, then this is sort of destructive of that. But having come out with a different sort of faith on the other end of working through questions and alternative interpretations and questions of evidence and all these kinds of things, that's precisely the reason I wanted to write this book. And Eerdmans recommended calling it Beyond Deconstruction to keep that word deconstruction in the title. But it's about anything from like renovating your faith, like proactively taking a look and saying, how certain am I about all this? Have I assumed these things are right? Is it possible that what the Bible says, some things that are not incorporated, even though I claim my church claims to be Bible believing? It doesn't have to be destructive, but even if it's destructive, right? Sometimes having a solid house to live in, the only way to get there is by tearing down this thing that you didn't pay any attention to for too long. You just assumed it was sturdy, and eventually it collapses around you, right? And so that's why, for some people, this experience of deconstruction is destructive, and that's been a criticism from some who like reject and say you shouldn't undergo this experience. But it's also been experienced as traumatically destructive by many who've undergone it. And this book is aimed particularly at those people to help rebuild, right? Not rebuild what collapsed in the same form, but to build something that you can talk about and think about positively. because for a long time, I myself, would have said, well, I'm still a Christian, but I don't subscribe to biblical inerrancy the way I used to, and I don't hold this view, I don't hold that view, and we're defining ourselves over against what we were, and we're always shaped by what we were, even when we're not any longer, in ways that we don't always admit. But being able to say positive things and not just negative things, I think, is important in any worldview.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And this book is, you can tell that it's in your voice, but it's different than a lot of your other work because, like you said before, you do a lot of, and every time I've had you on the show, I've had you on to talk about your contributions to biblical scholarship. So the next question I want to kind of ask you in two parts. I know you kind of talked about your experience in Bible college already, but what was your own personal process of deconstruction like, just how it shaped your faith, how you went from where you were to saying, I'm a Christian, and then beyond that. And then also just as an author and as someone who's written widely in the genre of biblical scholarship, what was it like to write a more personal book like this?
Yeah. Well, thank you. So always hard to know where to begin sort of a story about sort of one's journey. Grew up in the Catholic Church, and it was around the time of my confirmation that I stopped attending regularly, because this was supposed to be this sort of decisive moment, this real sort of it's becoming your own, and I didn't feel different, and it didn't have that significance for me personally. And so I went into a phase of trying to figure out what I believe. Still believed in God, but was not sure about a lot of other things. And eventually, make a long story short, was invited to a friend's church, and it was clear that it was real to them in a way that it wasn't sort of going to Catholic church had not been to me. And so just sort of called out to God and surrender, and had a born again experience in that context, and pretty much immediately knew that this has to make a difference to what I'm doing after high school, for instance, and things like that. And so volunteered on some children's camps in Ireland through a connection in that church, and met people who were from different cultures, Scottish, English, Irish, but also who were from other denominations. And so I realized that there are people who seem to have something like the faith that I now have, and yet hold these varied views on a variety of topics. And they think these things are crucially important, and I haven't even heard of some of them. And there are things that I've been hearing about emphasized that, if I ask them about them, it's like... And so wanted to study and find out more about this. And so went to Bible college and sought an opportunity to do so in the UK, to get that cross-cultural perspective, and at a college that was interdenominational. And I think that was crucially important in a lot of ways for my journey not being as traumatic as it could have been. I mean, it was still difficult and challenging, and there's a lot of wrestling and grappling with is it okay that I'm changing my mind about these things? And what do I do with the fact that the Bible doesn't seem to be confirming everything I thought it's supposed to about these beliefs? But UK evangelicalism is not as narrow nor as dogmatic across the board as American evangelicalism tends to be. And so in that context, there were opportunities to hear from a sort of an evangelical perspective challenges to things like the assumption of Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, right? And things like that, which otherwise it's like those liberal scholars are challenging them. And you had evangelical authors who were pointing out there are these things in the Pentateuch that refer to realities after the time of Moses, right? From the time of the monarchy. Therefore, the Bible itself is presenting evidence that this is from later than Moses in the form in which we now have it. And that's not only shaped my journey in important ways, because I realized that sometimes you can be defending your doctrines, even your doctrine about the Bible, from the Bible itself. But it's also shaped how I teach, because I realized that if you present these things not as, well, here's what some scholars have to say, but here are these texts. let's see if we can figure out why these are so confusing. Let's see if we can figure out why we have these different versions in these different gospels. That it's clearly, it seems to be the same story, and yet there are these differences. And then get from there to the synoptic problem, rather than starting with, so here's this thing we're going to learn about, say. Doing it inductively that way, I think for those for whom the Bible is important, it becomes the Bible raising the questions instead of scholars sort of questioning the Bible and potentially seeming to challenge it. And so all of this can be disconcerting, but one thing that I'm persuaded of, sort of with hindsight, is that the process is disconcerting because Christians, because churches have made it disconcerting, right? We've presented the faith, we've presented Christian faith as something that I mean, the Bible uses the language of, sort of received once for all, but it also uses the language of maturation and growing, right? And that second part, that idea that this is something that you sort of receive once for all, and there is a simplicity to it on one level, but it's something where your understanding should grow and you should develop. That part we sometimes not only neglect, some merely neglect it, some actively stifle it. And it's as a result of that, I think, rather than anything inherent, any kind of inherent tension between rigorous study of the Bible and personal faith. I mean, I'm convinced of that now, but I think that the hurdles were placed in the way by humans, and were not sort of something that had to be part of the package, as it were.
Yeah.
So I think that gets us to your first question. What was your second question again?
So what was it like to being a biblical scholar who often writes on academic subjects? What was it like to write a personal book like this?
Yeah. And I mean, I think in one sense, it wasn't that different from some things I'd done, just in the sense that I had shared some of these things, not in this kind of systematized form and not with all these details, but it had been blogging and had been doing other things where I was talking a bit more about my journey than I did. On the other hand, it's, there's something, writing, any kind of authorship, you're sort of putting yourself on the line. And if you're writing a novel, then it's like, will anyone like this? I mean, before that, will anyone read this? Right? Those kinds of questions. If you do scholarship, am I persuasive? Right? I think I've got a case here, but am I right? Will anybody find me persuasive? When you're telling your own story, I think that's sort of nerve-wracking in another way, because you're not just opening up your ideas for scrutiny. You're sharing, I think, more personal aspects of yourself and how you've wrestled with things along the way. And so, on the one hand, it's not entirely unlike what one does as an author across the board. On the other hand, I think it is making oneself more vulnerable in a lot of ways.
Yeah. No, I love that. Well, you talk in your book a lot about the dangers of fundamentalism, and I think that this is one of the. I was very fortunate, just in my own spiritual upbringing, that I was definitely brought up in an evangelical church, but we weren't like a fundamentalist church, and so I always kind of saw biblical fundamentalism as something that was outside of my own experience. But I do know, just from my own perception of kind of reading about deconstruction and seeing people who claim to have deconstructed and talking to them, that a lot of people that deconstruct out of fundamentalism, and they identify a lot of, even if we have differences in kind of worldview perspectives, we all kind of identify the exact same problems with fundamentalism, and I think you do a great job of addressing that in your book as well. So what are some of the problems with the fundamentalist Christian mentality?
Yeah, well, one of them is that it makes everybody who's not a fundamentalist feel like they have to apologize for the form of faith that they have, right? And on the one hand, there's this deceptive advertising about fundamentalism that I think it's important to highlight. No matter how far they go in any particular direction, let's say of biblical literalism, it's always selective literalism, right? It's not, there are plenty of people who would say, I am a Bible believing Christian, and they say, okay, so the dome in Genesis 1, they're like, well, it doesn't have to mean dome. It's like, okay, it's important, they'll say, to reject, millions of years according to geology, and radiometric dating and other things. And it's like, well, is it important to say that you believe literally with your heart and not with your brain, because Paul uses that language, and that was what some ancient people assumed was true. And they're like, well, no, there you can take it as a metaphor.
Right.
It's like, okay, but, you know. And the attempt to present one very, very narrow form of Christianity as not just, as the only form, legitimate form, as the default form, where everything else is a departure from it, it's just not true, right? I mean, historically, Christianity has been a lot of different things, and there has always been a conservative element in it. But you look at some of the teaching of Jesus. You look at Paul making the case for letting in uncircumcised Gentiles and considering them full members of the household of Abraham. You look at Jonah, as sort of, it's like God is showing mercy to these enemies we hate, and I really am mad at God about this, and sort of poking fun at him and telling this story that's comedic on so many levels. There's so much in there that is not narrow, that's not dogmatic, that's not that doesn't view faith in the sense of that's emphasized in the Bible, trusting God, as antithetical to questions and to serious reflection and to study and to conversation across difference and things like that. And so I think one of the big dangers of fundamentalism is that, on the one hand, it sets up a lot of people to lose their faith if they actually read the Bible at anything more than a superficial level. And on the other hand, by being dogmatic in ways that sound arrogant and often are arrogant, it presents Christianity in a way that puts others off. And to the extent that sometimes people in the media and other people outside who are not Christians think that this too is like the default form of Christianity, it does harm to it does harm to actually talking about Christianity and sharing one's faith or one's perspective as something that might deserve to be taken seriously, and that it's actually sort of open and honest in ways that fundamentalism is inclined not to be.
Yeah, and I love the way that you put it in your book is you talk about like the idolatry of dogma, that for a lot of Christians, the dogma actually kind of supplants faith in Christ. And I want you to comment on that, because I think that that's such a brilliant insight. And for myself, someone who like kind of proudly wears the label of Protestant, my fundamental belief is that the Bible should be kind of the primary source of authority. And there are so many people that put their dogmas and their traditions before biblical authority, or they can only read the Bible through the lens of their tradition. And I've kind of often made the same case in that sense, where it's almost like you're replacing this belief in authority with the authority of your tradition. And I just love how you equated that with idolatry. So speak to that. Why is that such a good analogy for speaking about the way that fundamentalists often think about their doctrines?
Yeah, so the Bible has a lot of warnings about idolatry. Like, it's a major focus. There are things about it in the New Testament as well, right? But it really is, in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, it's just this major focus, right? The first commandment or two commandments are about this, right? There's no other gods before me, but then not making images of God, right? Which is not simply saying the same thing over again, right? The Israelites were prohibited from making images, not just of other gods, but of their own God. And the golden calf story becomes this sort of this classic instance of like idolatry and what it's about. And I think we're supposed to get the sort of the symbolism and the rationale and why it's appealing. Moses had gone up the mountain. Moses was perceived as the sort of connection with this God who's sort of mysterious, but is revealing, sort of the divine self and will and creating a relationship with his people. And Moses had gone up the mountain, and where is he? It doesn't seem like he's coming back. And the people are down there waiting, and they're scared. And when we're scared, right, because a God who can vanish for a while and or seem to vanish, right, not necessarily cease to be omnipresent or anything like that, but is not felt to be present, and you have this person that you thought was your link to God, and that person now is no longer there. Life is disconcerting and worrying, and we find that so uncomfortable that we look for things that will give us the illusion of certainty. And really, that's what idolatry is about. It's we can know that God is with us because we have this symbol of God's presence, right? And although the golden calf, right, it's a graven image in the classic, literal sense, and so it's clearly prohibited by the second commandment. They do this thing, they make an image, and it's explicitly said to be an image of Yahweh, right? So it's not another god, it's God who brought them out of Egypt, and the next day they're going to have a celebration, a festival to Yahweh. But in later times, we see that the temple becomes an idol, for instance, right? And Jeremiah criticizes people for saying, the temple of the Lord, God will not let Jerusalem fall because God is on our side, because this is where God's presence is. We have the ark here, and so it's not just things like a golden calf that can become an idol. And I mean, the Bible can become an idol, right? I mean, it is quite literally, to use a phrase that's used of idols, it is quite literally the work of human hands, right? And one can say, yes, okay, well, but it's divinely inspired. Okay, but it's the work of human hands, right? That's the phrase that's used for idols. But dogmas, images of God, right, are prohibited, but our doctrinal images, right, are still attempts to imagine this is what God is like. This is how we define God. This is how we define what it means to relate to God. And all of that can be kind of as solid and as graven and as set in stone as literally things are literally set in stone. And so I think that's the real danger of idolatry, is that these other forms of idolatry are ones that we could miss because they're not sort of literal idolatry. And in fundamentalism, you'll talk about putting other things before God. Why is that warning never sort of applied to like the Bible or your church list of dogmas or anything like that, right? But those things, at their best, right? Images, like the image. I'm not suggesting here that when a child in Sunday school tries to draw God, it's like you've got to take it out and burn it and stone the child for breaking the second commandment, or As human beings, we can't help but try to imagine. We can't help but try to speak. What we need is to accept the fact that even our best attempts at images are not going to do justice to God. And when we make these and we believe that these things are functioning as indicators of the divine presence or are representations of the divine, then we mistake them for God, and we imagine that God can't be or do anything other than, or anywhere other than where this is. And so it's that constraining of a God that's infinite that I think is the real danger.
Yeah.
I could say more about that because there's a lot of aspects to that.
Yeah, I do kind of want to. You talk in your book about one of the dangers of those who deconstruct becoming just as closed-minded as the fundamentalism that they left behind. And so, in essence, deconstruction can, if it's not done in the right way, lead to a different sort of fundamentalism than the one that they left. But it's a fundamentalism nonetheless, where there's this complete lack of desire, or even fear maybe, of challenging any of the positions that they now hold in distinction of the ones that they formerly hold. So just talk about the dangers of deconstructing into another form of fundamentalism, and why deconstruction should make you more open-minded and curious.
Yeah. So it's the examples that come to mind are ones that I've sort of engaged sometimes directly, but often sort of indirectly through things I've written in response to things others have written. Think of folks like the new atheists, right? Who often, it's like, I mean, Richard Dawkins saying things like, sort of like religion is bad, always, all the time, kind of thing. And there are atheists who, like, I don't subscribe to Christianity, but I recognize that as an atheist in a context that is culturally Christian, a lot of my values are shaped by this heritage, and it's not all bad. There are people who've become atheists, but who've tried to start sort of atheist churches because they're like, the community was good. Okay, and it's that idea that, okay, this thing hurt me and deceived me. There were some things I was told that weren't true, and they were presented as the gospel truth, literally and metaphorically. And now I see, that the package was not pure, unadulterated truth the way it was. And so swing to the other side and say, it's all lies, it's all bad, it's all, and things are rarely that simple, right? And that's one of the things in history, that the study of history brings to things, is realizing that you can have a story that's a mixture of, it's history overlaid with symbolism, or it's history and but there are hints of legend in there, things like that. The Jesus mythicists seem to me to be an example of this pendulum swing thing, where it's like they believed that this is a divine figure walking the earth, and that these texts are 100% true, and they do this pendulum swing to being, not questioning, okay, could there be a historical figure who then, there's development of doctrine around this figure, and but it's like purely divine figure walking the earth who's clearly made up, just like all the other divine figures that I now reject, kind of thing, and this failure to investigate critically sort of the type of thinking, that sort of shaped your fundamentalism, so that it expresses itself in ways that are kind of, in one sense, diametrically opposed. Right. It's like, yes, Jesus versus no Jesus. But on the other hand, the sort of the mentality and the types of argumentation, the framework has not been examined. And so when undergoing deconstruction, I think it's important that one look at it at, sort of as a system, and look at the foundational level, and look at the components individually and evaluate them, but also ask, what was the mentality and the values here, and am I just shifting those into allegiance for a different camp, rather than maybe rethinking some of the values themselves.
Yeah, no, I think that's a perfect description. And again, it's just something that everyone who undergoes this process of transformation has to be aware of. You also you had a chapter or section of the book that's very near and dear to my heart. And in my adult life, I have found my home in the Wesleyan tradition. And one of the things I love about Wesleyanism is that we're very much action centered. And you talk in your book about how when you go through that process of deconstruction, your faith should transition to a more like action-oriented way of life. And you made this excellent point that I had never thought of before, where you talk about how in the Bible we have Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7, and this is, a call to people or a call to, to Israel to radically obey God. And it's basically all about actions. It's all about what you do. And then fast forward a couple of 100 years, you get to the creeds, and it's all about what to believe. And that's actually a huge intellectual transformation within Christianity. So I want to talk to you about that. How do you think that transition from action in the New Testament to like creeds and doctrines in the later patristic period, how did that shape the church? And then why should deconstruction lead to us wanting to live out our faith, to act?
Yeah. And, for those of us, it doesn't matter whether it's Baptist, Wesleyan, or Presbyterian, Pentecostal, anything else, those who are under the umbrella of Protestantism, right, have this awkward relationship with works, yes. Right, because of this emphasis on faith, and tried to be clear in the book that there's something there that it's important to cling to. What I try to focus on is that the kind of faith that I think Paul was emphasizing is that sort of trust in God. It's this sort of relationality. It's reliance on God. It's not assertion that certain doctrines are true, right? And one of the things that one can critique that form of religiosity in terms of, from a Protestant perspective, is that it basically turns passing a doctrinal exam into a work that one does to earn one's own salvation, right? Which is problematic, right? Abraham would not have passed a Christian doctrine exam, right? I mean, there's so many things that come along later and yet for Paul, he's the paradigm of trust, right? The paradigm of faith. And so clearly that's the faith that Paul's talking about is trust in God. And we could get into a whole thing about, what are the works that Paul was talking about and things like that. But ultimately, I think there's this temptation to substitute, affirming doctrine in the place of like loving one's enemies and doing these various things that Jesus called us to. Because to be honest, however counterintuitive, however seemingly paradoxical or irrational a set of beliefs are, affirming them is easier than loving your enemies, right? And so I think we actually do. I mean, I think this is another example of sort of trying to turn Christianity into something that we can, say, oh, I did it, and I'm confident now, right? And get ourselves into that place where it's, And so I don't want to take away from that sense that Christianity is relational, and in a relationship, it's not about sort of earning, and that's a classic Protestant critique, right? And that was the issue with the the older brother, right? That's the parable that we often call the parable of the prodigal son, but it's actually a story about two sons, and the older brother is the older son is the real point of it, is that he's been living at home and obeying, but he's understood this as, I keep in line until you die, and then I inherit everything. Whereas the younger son, precisely by rebelling and coming back, eventually realizes, oh, this is about a relationship. I did worse than like waste my father's money. I broke a relationship here, and I think we can keep that, and in doing so can realize that what you do matters to preserving a relationship, right? It's not just, I have these inner feelings of love towards my significant other that I never do anything about, right? That's not how relationship works. And so I think that one of the things that's, I think, exciting about recovering this is that it has something that can speak to that tendency to neglect like what we do, in a Protestant context, and to explore ways that it can be integrated in ways that don't ultimately undermine the things that Protestantism has, I think, emphasized that are healthy and important and right.
Yeah. And you also talk about the need for kind of reflecting on your personal experience, but beyond that, also being involved in a community, and that both of those are essential to rebuilding your faith on a more solid ground. So what can our experience, and then also I guess it's a discipline or a habit of being involved in a community, what can those do to help us build a stronger faith?
Yeah. So, I mean, initially, if you have had the catastrophic collapse of your worldview, you have a community where they were like, we love you unconditionally. And then you're like, well, I no longer subscribe to this view. And it's like, please leave.
Yeah,
we're going to show you the door. And you feel hurt. You need people who can relate to where you are now and who will kind of affirm you at that point in your journey. But in one's faith journey, as in politics, as in seeking information about medicine and science and economics and other things, we can get into bubbles, right? We can surround ourselves just by people who will always say, yeah, no, you're right. Those other people are the problem.
Yeah.
And that's not good for us, right? I mean, we need voices that challenge us. Not necessarily the same ones that, if you were surrounded by a particular, you definitely want to diversify and get some different ones. But it's not as though you leave behind that narrow fundamentalism and you reach this point where it's like, now I've got all the answers and now it's all sorted out. And now my faith is completely mature and I've got beyond all those narrow things. And it's a process. And having people who are different at different points in that process, and people who disagree, the very act of talking across difference is one of the things that facilitates us learning humility, right? Which is crucial to the life of faith and is a fundamental Christian virtue that Jesus taught. It's how we learn empathy, right? The attack on deconstruction has been gone hand in hand with an attack on empathy, which has been just fascinating to watch. People thinking these things that are woven into the sort of the teaching of Jesus and are there in the Bible, and treating them as vices rather than virtues. But so I mean, I emphasize finding community, but making sure that it's diverse community. And if you can't find that locally, then supplement it with online community. And online community can be deeply meaningful, right? And so I absolutely, finding online communities and multiple communities where you can have the kinds of conversations that will help you grow and be challenged and built up in a balanced way so that you make progress. We all need that. I mean, if you're doing something as basic as learning to play an instrument, you need to be challenged but affirmed, right? If you're never affirmed, you'll give up and lose heart. If you're not challenged, you're not making any progress. Why should faith and growing in faith be any different?
Yeah. No.
Finding local community, I think is crucial, just because there are some aspects of living out our values and our commitments that one can't do in the same way and to the same extent online. Right. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that, and I did want to kind of talk to you a little bit about the politics of deconstruction because you bring it up in your book, and it is one of these issues that has, like, I mean, think like everything in our society becomes so politicized that it's almost hard to have like a rational conversation about it. And I'm someone, my experience growing up in an evangelical church that was extremely heavily right wing and involved in Republican politics, I was kind of repulsed by that from a young age too. And then I wound up discovering libertarianism, and that was kind of my solution, I guess, to the political problem that was posed by the evangelical church. But I've noticed, and you bring this up in your book as well, that when a lot of people go through the process of deconstruction, they move from the political right to the political left, which I just think that that's an interesting phenomenon. And I want to get your take on that. And I guess to kind of set this question up, as you might know, back in the fall, Eerdmans published a book called Why Christians Should Be Leftist. And Phil Christman, he's an English professor at the University of Michigan. He wrote the book. I had him on my show to talk to him because I was just interested. Like, I wanted to hear what his take was. And we were able to have a really great conversation because we were, like respectful to each other. And I learned a lot. And I thought that it was really good. It was good and eye-opening and revealing to have, like what you were saying before, those kind of conversations across the aisle. And since you in your book, you say that you refer to yourself loosely as like a progressive or a liberal Christian. I want to know, what does that label mean to you? And then why do you think that when many people deconstruct, they deconstruct from the right to the left?
Yeah. And when I use the term, talking about a progressive or liberal Christian, that there are like, what we might call, progressive or liberal evangelicals who like subscribe to all the classic doctrines, but are sort of socially, and their view of how to do economics is on the sort of progressive end of the spectrum. There are people who are politically, and economically, are much more. It's like we should support business innovation, and the whole economy will benefit, and that more to the right, sort of in the terms of the economic vision for the society, and yet whose doctrines are. It's like you can believe whatever you want, sort of thing. And so it's and so these terms are vague. They are comparative. I mean, I'd be interested to hear, because we talk about sort of libertarianism as a vision, sort of for politics and economics, but what is a libertarian view of Christian faith? Like, what might it mean to be a sort of a libertarian with respect to that? I mean, is it? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, for me, the fundamental insight, and a lot of this came from reading like the work of Michael Gorman. His book, Cruciformity, had a huge impact on my spiritual life when I read it in college. And I really do think that following Jesus means that you have to be consistently committed to nonviolence. And I think that libertarianism is at its heart based on the non-aggression principle, which is the principle that you don't have the right to aggress against anyone else. And so when you aggregate that out into, politics and economic transactions and things like that, libertarianism is just kind of the consistent implementation of nonviolence. And that's why it was so attractive to me as a Christian, because it gave me, and also the fact that I'm kind of insecure in my own intellect, and that I know that there's a lot of things that I don't know, and I want to learn from people that are smarter than me. And so I don't want to be put in a position where I'm trying to impose my very limited mindset on other people. I'd rather just live in a society where people are kind of free to pursue their own ends and have conversations about that. And we can determine based on, rational, respectful conversation, which ideas are true and which ideas are not. And so that was what really attracted me to it, because I felt like with Jesus's teachings on nonviolence in particular, that was the most politically and economically compatible with that.
Yeah, thank you. And that's really helpful. I mean, I think, when it comes to, sort of doctrine, I think the same approach should apply. I mean, discuss, try to persuade, if you're convinced that you're right about this interpretation of this text, or about how to practice, following Jesus in society, discuss. And if you persuade lots of people, everybody wants to get on board and do this thing together of their own free will, then that's great. And if not, then debate and try and see if you can figure out. And I think, here too, it's one of those places where the pendulum swing, just going to the other side of a perceived sort of ideological spectrum is unhelpful, right? Particularly in an American context, because as somebody who's lived in Europe in more than one country, the United States is not polarized. if you put it in, I mean, our two political parties, plop them down in any major European democracy, and they will be sort of these two parties that would probably make an
Right.
alliance in order to keep like the far right and the far left
Yes.
out,
Yeah.
right? The
Yeah. Yeah.
communists and the
I
Nazis,
totally agree. Yeah.
and so and so there, just as is true, I think, with doctrine, and with belief, right? It's not as though, well, if you cease to believe this, that, and the other, then you may as well be an atheist. It's like, why not? Why not an Episcopalian who's a liberal and who doesn't subscribe to this, that, or the other? Why not why not Jewish? Why not Buddhist? Why not deist? Why not? There are other options, and that's also true when it comes to political options and economic options. So my wife grew up in communist Romania, and so she has a really interesting
Yeah.
perspective on things. Has a really interesting perspective on sort of authoritarianism in our present context, which is fascinating. She thought she was done with certain things that now she's like, really,
Yeah.
you're gonna have that here. On the other hand, it's interesting to see how, as somebody who is part of a community, right, a Romanian Baptist, part of a community that was persecuted by the communist authorities. On the one hand, she's not a fan of that, that sort of ideology per se. On the other hand, some things that they said, as by way of critiques of capitalism, sort of to her as a Christian, who grew up in that context, sort of ring true to her, sort of in this, and so figuring out, it's like, okay, so if Eastern European communism, it's like not a good option, right? Hopefully, you'd think that people would be able to agree on
Right.
that. Is the only alternative, unbridled capitalism? Well, just as we don't have among fundamentalists the full possible extreme of literalism, we don't have sort of completely unbridled capitalism in this. There are things where we think, okay, it's better to manage this, or it's better to put some limits on it, or and again, coming back to the point about libertarianism and not opposing things by force, those are things where the minority that had the sort of economic power sometimes objected to some of these limits on
Right.
on
Right.
their
Yeah.
pursuit of wealth, but the majority could sort of agree, and eventually, and came out through a democratic process. And so, what are the options that we're missing, right? What are the things that we could do if, and what are the other ideas, right, that we might come up with if instead of just having the back and forth and the shouting matches between a perceived perceived polar opposites, right? We actually had talked about things, and we brainstormed, and we compromised, and we came up with alternatives. That's like, okay, well, what I think you're really trying to accomplish is this, and I'm on board with the idea. I just don't think that that's the way to
Yeah.
accomplish it. The reason I pursue this, it's like, well, then we don't disagree on the thing we're trying to accomplish. Let's see if we can figure out which of these things works. Hey, look, neither of them works. Maybe we should try something else. And so I think one of the dangers of the fundamentalism that you get on both sides of the political spectrum sometimes, right? Not always, but sometimes, and on both sides, on different religious camps and different anti-religious camps, is that approach that way, it'll lead you to miss options that are worth considering, and that's to everybody's detriment.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And that goes back to what you were saying earlier about action and how significant that is for Christians. It's like if we follow the teachings of Jesus and we're commanded to love our neighbors and our enemies, then we should be open to having these conversations with people that are different than us. And I know, like, for me, like the big turning point for me, I had and still have, I guess, very traditional views on like sexuality and marriage. But I was in ministry in 2015 when the Obergefell decision was made for same-sex marriage. And that was really the first time that I had ever really tried to think systematically about politics. And there were a lot of people in my traditional church that were very upset and scared about what was going to happen with that. But I came to the very unpopular conclusion that, like, regardless of what my particular views on human sexuality were, I don't really think that there's a place for me to impose that on people that don't share my worldview, and that we're still called to like love everyone and treat them as the image-bearing people that we believe that they are. And so at that time, I was like, and I still agree with this. I was like, I don't see any problem with like legalizing this. Like, I think it should be. And there were a lot of people that were very upset with me for taking that position, even as a traditionalist. But that just goes to show you that, like, I think that there are more nuanced ways to look at this and more humanizing ways to look at this. And we break outside of the black and white either or, that we can actually have more productive conversations that like build people up and don't tear them down.
Yeah, and as somebody who's settled in the Baptist tradition, married a Romanian Baptist, and it was pretty much set from there. But one of the historic emphases of the Baptists in particular was the separation of church and state, right? That when you have the state telling you should practice your faith in this way, and or trying to impose things from it becomes one variety of faith doing that, which sometimes leads to Christians being persecuted, and the Baptists were persecuted. But it's fascinating that so many people who identify themselves as not just Christians but as Baptists are so eager to legislate for others to do things that are based in values that they don't share and a faith commitment that they don't share. And it's yeah.
Yeah. And that was, I had the opportunity, and he was really cool to me, but I had the opportunity to debate Stephen Wolfe, like one of the Christian nationalists, like one of the very prominent Christian nationalists. We did that a couple of years ago, and then I had him on my show to explain his position. Like I said, he was a really nice guy, very cool to me, everything like that. But that was the point that I kept on bringing up. It's like, okay, if you want to live in a society where the church gets to impose its values on everyone by force, well, what happens when your church loses and another church wins, right? Like that's a really scary prospect. And I think that, I think that we need to be able to get beyond that as a civilization,
Yeah. I mean, I've been saying for many years that it's like, the people who are advocating for prayer in school, and then, the Protestants, it's like, so what did you learn in school today? Hail Mary, full of grace. It's like, wait, no. So, it's like, it's not as though, and this is the other thing that I think, connects the book with, these other, sort of areas of life that we've been talking about, is that it's not about pursuing this one perfect worldview, right? We often imagine that we can have that, right? Even if there was such a thing, our human sort of alignment with it would be flawed, because we are we have human shortcomings. But worldviews are human constructions, and they they can reflect the divine and point to the divine, but they're always going to fall short. And the same is true with solutions to questions of like religious freedom. Like, is the attempt to keep church and state separate? It's like, that is so messy. And how do you even do that when you have somebody who's a person of faith and is elected? It's like, what does that even look like? And so, of course, their faith is affecting how they but it's better than some of the other options, right? And there may be better options still that we have yet to think of. And so we should always, on the one hand, be not shutting down that it's like, well, this is an imperfect solution. It's like, okay, but it's a solution, and it's let's maybe we should try it. If it's too imperfect and it has like lots of shortcomings, and this new worldview that you're building is going to be just as shoddy as the one that collapsed around you, and it's going to hurt you again, then think creatively, right? And if we had more of us doing that in terms of doctrine, and in terms of community, and in terms of how we love our neighbors, and how we care for those who are vulnerable in our society, and all of these things, who knows what we might come up with, right? But because we tend to rally around the creeds, the dogmas, the symbols, whatever it is, the communities that we already have, we often we stagnate. And one of the things you learn from studying the history of the church is just how the fact that if you were to take Paul and put him in a time machine and drop him in a mega church, I mean, he'd be like, whoa, what is this? This is, there'd be things he'd recognize, but there'd also be some things where he'd be like, a lot has changed since my time, right? And faith is not static. It's not supposed to be static. It can't be static. And being open to the fact that we have to grow, right? If we have a healthy faith and a healthy relationship, and that our thinking about politics, economics, biblical interpretation, being a scholar, right, is about trying to see, are there new ideas we haven't tried out yet, and that's what I try to do. And sometimes I'll be wrong, but I think trying out new ideas is generative and is helpful in moving discussions forward. And really, I think that's one reason why I felt like there's a close connection between my academic work and my academic trajectory in this book. It's not just that studying the Bible academically challenged some of my assumptions about the Bible, but I think that some of the skills that I've been learning to focus on and try to develop as a scholar are applicable to the life of faith, right? Like trying to approach it creatively, trying to remain open-minded while still trying to figure out what you think for yourself, and not lacking conviction, but still being open to changing your mind. I think that there are things that the life of faith can learn from that.
Yeah. Oh, I couldn't agree more with that. Well, James, we're almost at the end of our time today. Man, this has been great, and I've gained a lot of perspective from this as well. And I highly recommend everyone in my audience check out your book. I just have one more question for you. And there are a lot of people that listen to this show that have big questions about their faith, and I know because I've talked to them that there are some people in my audience that are like brand new to Christianity, right? Like they've just discovered it in the last couple of years, and so they're like building up from scratch. They didn't have to deconstruct anything. There was nothing there, and they're working on constructing their faith. So I want to ask you, what advice would you give to people that are trying to either build or for the first time or rebuild their faith that might help them get through that process?
Yeah. So, I mean, my advice to those who are just starting out is, that you don't have to build something narrow, but on the other hand, starting with things and just taking those things is fine, right? There's a need for, if you get a sort of a prefabricated house, you may find that some of the things that you inherit, in that, the workmanship was not as great. Looks like you've got some experience of this, right? If you get one that's been around for a long time, it stood the test of time. That says something for it. But on the other hand, how well has it been kept up and things like that? Are there updates needed for it to be in code and things like that? The things that we learn as homeowners. And so, if you're just starting out, it's okay to just enjoy this new house that you're in, and that's fine. If you approach it as something where this is not just finding all the answers to all your questions definitively once for all, but the start of a journey where some of the things that you hear are going to be, answers that you're going to be perfectly happy with for the rest of your life, and some of them may not be, right? And that figuring out which is which is an expression of your faith, right? Because if you make the thing that I think is true across the board is if you make central to your faith seeking God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, right? Seeking to love God and to know God, while recognizing that our human minds, right, God is beyond what we can grasp, right? That the love of God is too deep, too wide, this imagery is there in the Bible. Then you can approach it in a way that will know that there needs to be room for growth, and that you're never going to have answers that are going to absolutely encapsulate God and tie up all the loose ends, right? So there's always going to be this room for more, no matter how much you grow. If you approach it that way, then I think that will avoid you needing to have that sort of catastrophic experience of faith collapse, because as you learn something new and it challenges what you thought was true, instead of that being, oh no, my faith is being shaken, it's like, oh great, I'm growing in my faith and I'm growing in my knowledge of the Bible, and that can be a positive thing. And sometimes it's challenging, right? You think about growing from childhood, we get things, that are presented to us quite simply. Most people don't have a traumatic experience when you discover that, history is, you at one point you were given a bunch of dates and names and told this is the truth. And then you find out that there's this whole messy process in figuring out, how do we know that stuff and how much is certain, and enjoy that discovery, right? Another thing that I'd recommend that I think is true across the board is be faithful to sort of where you are at the moment, and recognize that that's probably where you need to be, and be open to the possibility that, you might be ready to take another step, but don't assume that you have to rush to be somewhere else and, because someone else is there. We're not all at the same point on our journey. And one of the things that often happens is that we forget what we were like in the past. And so, you can have a conversation with someone and forget that, okay, if me now was somebody else having this conversation with me, 30 years ago or whatever it was, or something like that, or 20 years ago, or, I would have said, you're a heretic, get out of my face, right? And so, or, possibly, right? Not necessarily, right? Depends what the conversation's about. But we can forget, how avid we were, how sure we were, how close we were to hearing other perspectives. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have those conversations, but I think we can approach them differently and say, how could someone have said something then that would have helped me, at least start on the process of thinking more deeply about this thing that then I was, I was just set in my ways and, not open. And so just remembering where we've been and recognizing that not everybody has to be where I am. The other thing is that, you don't want to spend all of your time wallowing in, complaining about, what was. That's not healthy. And you don't want to move too quickly, right? If you have had a loss of faith, you don't want to move too quickly to what, I sometimes refer to as a rebound worldview, where it's like, look, this worldview has all the things that the other one was, let me down on. And so it's going to be anyone who's, and I've never done that in like a romantic relationship, so I can't speak to it, but I imagine that, you look for somebody who's the opposite in those ways that just didn't work with that previous relationship. And then this other person you find, okay, but then they have these other things, right? Because we're all human, and that's always going to be the case. And so, again, not expecting, take your time with it, take it slow, be thoughtful, look at details, and recognize that even if you do find a new worldview and you're like, okay, I've switched to, I'm going to go to this church now because they seem to be doing this better, and you find things that you're disappointed with, don't just say, okay, now I have to find another church because I'm disappointed about that. Talk with people, right? Sometimes people be like, wow, that's a great idea. We should totally do that, right? And so just be, if you start out in a very narrow form of Christianity, one of the things that you can miss is that there's some communities you could be part of where people will be like, oh, I love that idea. We've never done that before, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try it, right? Let's have a breakfast and invite people from the community. Let's do whatever. And so, being prepared to be surprised, pleasantly surprised by new communities and new people that you find. Just because people let you down doesn't mean everyone will let you down, right? Just because worldviews are imperfect doesn't mean that no worldview, like no house, could serve a useful purpose, for a particular phase in your life. Those are some of the things that I would share.
Yeah. Well, James, I really appreciate that. You have a very prolific career. You've released a lot of books. I'm going to put in the show notes links to the books that you have had in the past, but for people that are for the interviews I've done with you on the past and some of those books. But for those people that are interested in finding you, following you, finding your work, where would you send them?
Yeah. So I'm online in most places as Religion Prof. I mean, that was what my Twitter handle for a long time. And then when I realized that people weren't getting the Matrix reference in the original title for my blog, I changed it to Religion Prof. And so if you search like Religion Prof, James McGrath, you'll find often if you just type Religion Prof, and when Google says, did you mean religion space prof? You say no, you'll probably find me. So yeah, do connect with me. And the one thing I want to say is that, it really brings back to sort of where we started, or at least where we got early on in our conversation. Authors actually really find it meaningful when we hear from people who read what we write and find out that it was meaningful to them and it was helpful to them. And so if this book was helpful, things like Amazon reviews are always appreciated too, but just, send something, contact me on Twitter or on my blog or via email and just let me know. Because the reason I keep writing books is because I keep hearing from people who say, okay, that was helpful, that was interesting, that was worth it. I'm glad you wrote it. And so we'd really love to hear from people.
Perfect. Well, James, thanks again for coming on the show today.
Thanks again, Alex. It's been a wonderful conversation, as always.